Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Fifth Estate. It's great to see so many of you here for the first of our new fortnightly forums. I'm Sally Warhaft, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Lindsay Tanner. He, of course, represented the seat of Melbourne for the Labor Party from 1993 until 2010. He was the Minister for Finance and Deregulation in the Rudd government before announcing his retirement from politics on the day that Julia Gillard was sworn in as Prime Minister. He's now a best-selling author, advisor, a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at Victoria University, a man once described as too normal to be profiled. Please welcome Lindsay Tanner.
Thanks, Sally.
Lindsay, being normal's a bit off message at the moment. It's much more in the groove to be a psychopath or a liar or a dysfunctional or a wrecker. What happened last week?
Well, clearly I was prescient when I retired because I realised that there was no longer any place for me in the Australian political scene. I wasn't weird enough. But I was actually quite insulted when I was described as too normal to be worth a profile in the Fairfax Good weekend. I thought, God, I actually thought I was a bit weird, but clearly I'm not weird enough. Look, philosophical, I guess, but really I only told that story, which is, of course, an entirely true story, to illustrate what I think is a wider problem, which is that the way media and the Australian political scene interact is turning it more and more into a freak show, because the signals that are sent about what is rewarded and what enables you to get attention, which is ultimately what politics is all about, are of course encouraging people to act in more and more outrageous ways, and ultimately it's a killer game. You know, you don't have the option of saying, well, look, I'll just go a little bit hard or I'll try a little bit. You've got to go full bore, and if that's what the signals are telling you is the right thing to do, then you do it.
Do you think, though, there were any signals kind of operating last week? I mean, there was absolutely no sense at all of dignity or manners or courtesy. You're thinking like beam me up Scotty kind of signals or something like this? Well, I mean, it almost felt like a madness, and it was a strange situation, it seemed to me, that the leaders, the people that were involved in this slanging match, of course, weren't really talking to the Australian people. They were talking to each other via the media. Have you ever seen anything quite like it?
Well, everything of note in politics is at one level by definition unique, of course, but I can't think of circumstances that are directly comparable. But what I think is very interesting about what we've just lived through recently is we've now had two challenges to sitting prime ministers who effectively are in their first term. Julia Gillard, of course, was PM for a very short time before the 2010 election, but effectively two prime ministers in their first term who've been challenged from within their own party within the space of less than 2 years. If you scroll back through Australian history, challenges to sitting prime ministers from within their own party are extraordinarily rare. There's only been about 4 of them, I think, since the Second World War, and they are, of course, twice with Hawke and Keating. So Paul Keating challenged twice in 1991. Andrew Peacock challenged Malcolm Fraser in 1982. And, of course, Billy McMahon challenged John Gorton, effectively, in 1971. So these events don't happen very often. And the significant thing about the more recent ones, Hawke and Fraser being on the receiving end, was that in both cases you had a sitting Prime Minister who'd been there for about 7 years. So in other words, starting to get a bit politically long in the tooth, and it's not a big surprise that there's movement at the station looking to replace them. Whereas in this case, you've got twice within less than 2 years Prime Ministers who have not been there very long, who are subject to challenges. So leave aside your view on who was right or wrong, who is the villain and who is the hero or heroine or whatever, and just look at those realities. And what does that tell you? It tells you that now everything lives or dies daily by opinion polls and by the short-term media scrum, so that people no longer have the leeway to make difficult decisions, or there's much less leeway to make those decisions because they are forced to focus on daily survival. Those challenges are symptoms of a political process that's now, I think, very different from what it was even 10 or 15 years ago.
You, of course, were in the Gang of Four, or the kitchen cabinet. How much of a surprise was it what happened to Kevin Rudd, given how close you were to all the major players?
Well, I, perhaps famously, was kind of the last person to know what was going on. Always out of the loop, always a bit of a social misfit and all that kind of stuff. So what happened with me was that, because I was known, fairly well known, I think, as broadly a Rudd supporter, and also not somebody who's typically heavily involved in internal jockeying and machinations, nobody was sort of sidling up to me and saying, hey, I think we need to replace the leader. And of course, at the time, I was well advanced in my own sort of departure process. I wasn't worrying about anybody else going, I was worried about me going. And on the night it all happened, I was actually out to dinner with several of my staff, with Maria Van Vakenu, who is the member for Call, and with Shane Maloney, the famous author. Any of you who haven't read the Murray Whelan books, you should go out and buy them straight away, by the way. They are a documentary about the Victorian Labor Party, with just a few of the names changed. So I spent 2 hours chatting to Shane about, you know, where Murray was heading and what possibilities there were for future books and so on. And as this is occurring, we're getting this stuff coming off Sky News saying, oh, there's a challenge to Kevin Rudd's leadership and crisis meetings in the Prime Minister's office, and the list of 3 or 4 names is rattled off as who's in these meetings, and I'm one of them. And I thought, well, hang on a second, no, I'm actually sitting in a suburban pub, rather a low-rent suburban pub too, I'd hasten to add, in Canberra. I don't think I'm in the Prime Minister's office, therefore, if that's rubbish, then the rest of it's probably rubbish, oh, who cares? Anyway, I'm out of the place anyway, so whatever. And so, of course, by the time we got to about 9:30 or 10, it became clear from these reports that not only was there this big challenge, but it was kind of already over. So, in other words, I missed the whole thing. It's sort of, I was having a steak with Shane Maloney while it all happened, and by the time I worked out what was going on, it was over.
Had you planned to announce your retirement from public life the next day, or did you alter the day?
No, in fact, believe it or not, what occurred was precisely what was planned.
Had you told Kevin Rudd?
Yes. In fact, I spoke to Kevin 2 or 3 weeks before that day and said, I'm intending to retire, to not recontest, and effectively indicated, look, I'm happy to either step down when it's announced or continue until the death knock as a minister, whichever way you want to do it. He, of course, was in the middle of dealing with the mining tax issue and various other things, so he urged me to at least keep it open for a couple of weeks to hold fire. And so I ended up agreeing with him that we would hold off until Parliament was finishing. And so what I then did subsequently was organise a time to see him, which was on the morning of the 24th of June 2010 at 9:30am. I had an appointment with Kevin to, from my perspective, finalise the matter. Sorry, I am going. I'm going to announce it after question time in Parliament today. And of course, as it turned out, he had a conflicting commitment, which was a caucus meeting where he was being decapitated. So I sort of got pushed back in the agenda. So I eventually spoke to Julia later that morning, advised her of what was already in the pipeline, indicated that my intention was to still proceed with the announcement and also to make it absolutely clear, which is the complete truth, that this was completely unrelated to the change of Prime Ministers. So it was already decided.
A guy that was closer to almost anyone to the centre of power, and you had no idea about the challenge, and you were the only person, it seems, whose day wasn't completely stuffed up by the change of Prime Minister.
Well, I had other things that were causing my day to be complicated, like ringing large numbers of people and apologising to them and all this sort of stuff. But
do you think Kevin Rudd would have won? the election if he'd not been toppled?
Look, I think probably, but you never quite know. Like, I think it's significant that John Howard suggested that he would have won in his autobiography, and John Howard, for whatever faults he has, is a guy who knows a lot about winning elections.
In fact, he's adamant about it, isn't he? He thinks he would have robbed time.
So, but one of the great lessons I've learned over my long time in politics is that, in truth, you never know. I've never forgotten when Steve Bracks replaced John Brumby. There was a distinct element of opinion in Labor Party circles along the lines of, why are we doing this? We're going to get smashed in the next election anyway. All we're doing is kind of burning two leaders, so why don't we just let Brumby stay there, take the inevitable defeat, and then have Bracks come in subsequently as a clean-skinned new leader? All you're going to do is burn Steve Bracks. And of course, Steve upset this theory by winning. So that provided me with a great lesson that you just never know, and this is why one of the common misconceptions that people often put about in political behaviour is that politicians are strategic in their choices about whether or not to put their hand up. So why would you go for leader of the party at this particular time, or why would you try this vacancy? Well, because the answer is it might be the only bloody chance you get. And you know that. And so if you sort of step aside and think, well, actually it doesn't suit me, the odds are bad, I reckon if I hang around for another couple of years I'll get another chance and there'll be much better circumstances, it's very likely that you won't get another chance. And politicians instinctively know this. So the right thing for Steve Bracks to do at that point is not to say, oh no, I'm probably going to lose the election, so I won't stand now, I'll stand later. The right thing for him to do is say, when do I start? And that's what he did, and he won.
Your book Sideshow focuses on the relationship between politics and the media, but you cannot blame the media for what happened last week, surely. I think that...
I'll try.
Well...
No, I won't. That was a joke. Sorry.
I can't think of one thing in that whole kind of spew that happened last week that I didn't know. And all of it I read about or heard it reported. It just wasn't confirmed, or the politicians at the time either lied or refused to answer the question. But it was all out there, an uncollaborative caucus, or the leadership, a kitchen cabinet. I mean, there was nothing that I can think of that I actually learned last week. So if you're not going to blame the media, what is wrong with the ALP?
Look, we might have to revise the amount of time that we're talking here. Look, I don't blame the media per se, but I think some of the less edifying elements of the previous week or two, the events there, are actually symptoms of a construct or a system that has evolved in our national politics, which the media have largely driven. And so it's not so much that you can sort of isolate particular things and attribute specific blame for those particular things. It's more that you're seeing I think, a degeneration in politics generally, which just feeds on itself. And so I'd part company with one of your introductory comments where the notion that this was people in the Labor Party talking to each other, I think, isn't correct. What you've got is a kind of free-for-all battle over public opinion, where you've got one side, the Rudd side, saying people want Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, therefore who cares whatever people in the Labor Party think, he is the popular choice. And so you've got a range of things being promoted on that angle. And then you've got the other side saying, well, actually, he's popular amongst people who don't know him, but we can give you some inside information that might change your mind. And this was really a giant battle over public opinion.
Well, designed to smash him out of any second contest.
That appeared to be the case, although I'm always cautious about imputing motives to people in politics because it can be quite dangerous and misleading. But I think the significant thing about this is that you're now getting this stuff being played out completely openly in the public arena. Like, the contrast I made was with the Latham diaries. So when the Latham diaries hit in 2005, I think from memory, they were somewhat bracing for those of us who were still on the front bench of the Labor Party. A lot of fairly gratuitous character advice was contained there for a lot of people.
I remember Julia Gillard actually was, I think, the only politician that he gave a good rap to, and she was quite embarrassed about it.
Yeah, well, there were probably some people who were embarrassed they didn't get enough sort of brickbats in the diaries and were worried. But the collective Labor response was basically to take it on the chin. And say, OK, we don't like this, we're going to get through it, and it'll be yesterday's fish and chip wrappings in a week or two, and we'll just have to live through it. Whereas this time round, OK, there's more at stake, it's different circumstances, it is just much more open. And again, I think that there has been a change in the way Australian politics works, and I think it is largely driven by the media. We have, in fact, had Kevin Rudd been successful, he would have been, I think, the 7th federal leader of the ALP in about 10 or 11 years, or something like that. So, but
the logic of this is, if the media was successful, then Kevin Rudd would be our Prime Minister again.
Oh, no, not necessarily. I think the media angle on all this stuff has been actually quite mixed. So I don't think it's true to say, and I only say this as a half-informed consumer of the media, I don't think it's true to say that there was an obvious weight of media barracking, pushing either side. You could probably argue the toss about that, but the media want to fight. They want a brawl, and so basically they are looking for the next leadership contest. And one thing I can guarantee is that had Kevin Rudd won, the Tony Abbott versus Malcolm Turnbull contest would have started the following day.
I'm sure that's true, but it doesn't take away that there is some terrible cultural problem, it seems to me, and I think a lot of other people, with the Labor Party and with politics and our political culture in general in Australia, but it's the Labor Party at the moment who are in government and who have been behaving appallingly, and so therefore, there's the focus. What is it? Is there something in Labor that kind of attracts this stuff and these people? Look,
I accept there is a cultural problem in our politics. It's hard to know whether it's worse on our side, because the big problem you have is that you're always comparing government and opposition at any given time, and these are separate planets. It's something I learned after having had a bit of experience of both, that it's very hard to compare behaviour and norms between the two major parties at a particular time when one's the government, one's the opposition. So I think it's very difficult to say whether we are worse than the Libs. There's something that I realised relatively late in my political career that I think is quite important in all this. That is that if you're a guy in the business world or a woman in the business world who aspires to big things and you miss out on what you aspire to, the odds are pretty good that you will land something that is a consolation prize that is almost as good, if not as good, as what you aspired to. John Borghetti missed out on the job as CEO of Qantas. He is now CEO of Virgin, for example. In politics, there is no equivalent. I did not have the option of turning up to the Liberal Party and saying, folks, the Labor Party didn't want me as leader, I'm available, what do you reckon? I was not able to head across to Thailand or the Philippines or India and say, look, those idiots in Australia don't want me to run the joint, how about if I run yours?
I reckon they'd say that option was there today. For anyone sitting in in the government benches?
I doubt it, but that's the thing, is it's a vicious game because there are no second prizes. And I've seen, it's actually quite interesting, I've seen apparently meaningless ballots for a junior shadow minister position in an opposition that's in deep trouble, where there's been a kind of internal factional ballot, and this has been fought tooth and nail. And the result has been, kind of a 3-vote margin. And eventually I kind of worked out that there's a very significant chance that the outcome of this ballot could be quite decisive in the career of one of those people. That the opening emerges, if you miss out on that opening, by the time another one emerges, you may no longer be able to take advantage of it. So it is incredibly cutthroat and brutal for that reason. It is distinct and different from all other walks of life, I think. And the other thing that makes it even harder is that it is the only job I can think of where you sign up for a 3-year stint without knowing what your job's going to be. So you put your hand up and say, OK, I want to be the member for Melbourne, or be re-elected as the member for Melbourne. And if you're lucky enough to get the contract, then the question arises, will you be a backbencher in opposition, a backbencher in government, a minister, a shadow minister, prime minister, treasurer? You do not know. And often the range of possibilities is quite substantial. So it is quite an unusual occupation, and that, I think, tends to bring out the worst in people's behaviour. And it is when you're confronted with these things.
It'd be very hard now to, obviously, I think there's one GP in all of the parliament. There are no nurses. There's no diversity.
This is a big problem.
It's basically lawyers on one side and union, student politic professionals on the other. And
nobody in the audience ask what my CV's got on it, please.
Both.
Yeah, all of the above. And also staffer, although I was only a staffer for a couple of years.
To, who was it?
Senator Barney Cooney.
That's right. How can you diversify and improve the range and kinds of people that are getting into politics?
This is a really difficult problem, and I think this is actually a crucial issue, that more and more you're ending up with people who are extremely clever in a narrow sense, but lack the depth and sort of three-dimensional wisdom that goes with life experience in most walks of life. And I think that's a real problem. And it's not so much that you want a parliament that is full of, sort of timber fallers and nurses and train drivers and whatever. You want a mixture. So people who are, in a sense, political professionals and who've grown up in the art of politics and have little experience of work and life outside that, they play a very important role too, and the skills that they have are actually very important to getting good outcomes. But we've got too many of them, and I think that is a real problem. I think it is particularly a problem for the Labor Party. As to solving it, that's a really big challenge. The only idea I've come up with so far, and I think this would be extremely difficult to do in practice, is to have a mechanism in your public funding rules that weights the public funding in favour of people who do not have political class backgrounds. So in other words, you say to the parties, you can have as many apparatchiks as candidates as you like, but understand that your dollars per vote for candidates who are not of that insider class will be higher than your dollars per vote for somebody who fits the following characteristics, e.g. has worked as a staffer in the past 5 years or whatever. I think if you change those dynamics and give the parties an external incentive to change their behaviour and say, OK, we've got to take responsibility for getting a more balanced team here, and we will be rewarded with more campaign dollars if we do, that might have an effect. Very, very hard to do. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate that, but you've really got to have some mechanism that puts the pressure on the parties to...
Were there ideas like that in the post-election report that Faulkner and Carr and Brax worked on? That
part of that report, of course, has not been made public.
That's right.
And not being a member of the ALP National Executive, I therefore haven't seen it. And the bit that was made public, I don't think so. But I wouldn't swear to it. And certainly, as far as I know, I'm the only person who's signed up to the nutty idea that I've just expressed. I'm not necessarily advocating that idea of tying public funding to it. I'm really using that as a means of illustrating the point that you would have to do something as brutal as that to force behavioural change. One of the things, again, that people don't really recognise about Labor, and I suspect the same is true of the Liberal Party as well, is that in the final analysis, no one is in charge. There is no sort of single controlling individual or tiny group of individuals that is acting in concert,
clearly
running the organisation. This may come as something of a shock to you. And so what you're dealing with mostly is this kind of fluid, ever-moving, ever-morphing, ever-changing galaxy of interests and empires and ambitions that are entering into alliances and enmities and changing configuration all the time, that occasionally coalesce into something vaguely coherent to, fight and win an election or whatever. But the notion that there is anybody actually in charge kind of prosecuting the longer-term interests of the organisation is not correct, by and large. It is not correct. Every now and then, by sheer good luck, you end up with somebody like Bob Hogg in a key position of power who has both the clout and the detachment to pursue a kind of the organisational interests of the party with some effect. Now, there's no question the current National Secretary, who worked for me for a period of time, certainly has the detachment and the interests of the party at heart, but he's new in the job. He doesn't have a Labor machine or numbers background. He's got a union background. I hope that over time he will develop into a Bob Hogg type person. He's got the raw material. But by and large, it's a bunch of people all fighting over their own self-interest. And politics undoubtedly is the same everywhere around the world.
Oh, I don't know. It felt like the rest of the world have been looking upon us like we're in some sort of twilight zone, but I can't really speak for other places. In 2004, you were opposition communications spokesman, and you had real concerns about the direction of the Labor Party at that time. And you announced that you would not stand for a position on Mark Latham's front bench, that you had serious reservations about the emerging Labor response to our latest election defeat. And you went to the back bench. This is, 8 years ago, and it seems like things have only got worse. Did you learn anything on the backbench, and what was it like to be there, and what do you think Kevin Rudd is going through right now?
I think it's probably a bit more unpleasant for him than it was for me.
Well, you were a person then too of ideas and vocation.
Well, but I hadn't sort of been publicly eviscerated, so I'd kind of eviscerated myself, which is far less painful. Look, at the time, and I've basically stayed pretty quiet about the reasons for why I was departing, and as it turned out, those reasons effectively became academic, because ill health meant that Mark Latham ceased to be leader a few months later, and things moved on to a different stage. So I have never really talked about them in any sort of public sense, nor do I intend to. And there's nothing particularly dramatic, it's just my view about where things were heading and what I thought was quite wrong. It was good at the time to be able to bury myself in some complex issues and to devote a bit of time to learning on stuff. So I did quite a lot of work on the technicalities of public-private partnerships, for example, which are still a very important issue for Australia, as to how they work and to get the right setting so you actually get value for the taxpayer and you don't have private sector players winning the lottery and all that kind of stuff. So I was able to do quite a bit of serious policy work and all that sort of stuff. But I was only on the backbench, as it turned out, for about 8 months, I think, because Kim Beazley brought me back as Shadow Finance Minister in about, from memory, June of 2005. Kevin, I think, is obviously in a very, very different situation, and how he deals with it, time will tell. But one thing that I think even his bitterest enemies would concede is that he has an extraordinary kind of steel and resolve and capacity to just keep going when things are in very difficult shape and against him. So I don't think, if he makes the choice about what he's going to do and how he's going to deal with it, even if it looks like a really, really tough thing or not a very pleasant thing to do, I've got no doubt that he'll see it through in whatever way he's called it. But these kind of very public contests and occasional public humiliations that we all get in varying degrees and varying guises, you have to be an amazingly strong person just to keep going and to take it on the chin and to stick at whatever you're doing, and it is a very, very brutal game, and the kind of, to be John Hewson, the guy who lost the unlosable election and ensured that we got back into power and so on. Now that's a burden he'll carry for the rest of his life, rightly or wrongly. So you wear these things and they
John
stick.
Howard losing his own seat.
Well, exactly. Now, he had the consolation of having 11 or 12 years as Prime Minister before he lost his own seat, so he can probably go, oh, well, could have been better, but I think I'll give myself a tick for all of that. But yeah, it's... So, but the one thing I do know about Kevin is that he's an extraordinarily tough, mentally and emotionally tough person, notwithstanding the odd tear being shed on the day of his... dismissal in 2010. He's a very, very emotionally tough person.
Obviously, you've listed some of the, previous challenges and crises and dramas. It does seem to me, though, that there is something different at the moment in our political culture, and it's really bad. It's really damaging, and I wonder how you come back from it, how you can repair when things get so out of control, how you can ask people with any self-respect to respect you again when you've behaved in the way we've seen people behave.
Look, I agree with your premise. I think there is something really bad in the political culture, but I don't think it's just a narrow, oh my God, we've just had a gang of people being nasty to each other for a week. Like we've had that before. This was a pretty bad example, but we've had that before, and I think you can probably argue that it's gone to a new level, yes, but it's not that dramatically unusual. What I think it is more pertinent here is that I open up the paper this morning and there's a smiling picture of Tony Abbott in full combat gear and a helicopter staring out at me. Now, why would that be, I wonder? It probably took him a bit of time to organise all that and to get all the clobber on and whatever.
Getting ready for that battle with Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, possibly right, but actually the real answer is pretty simple. And that is that he faces, and I emphasise, I'm not being personally critical of Tony Abbott here because he's behaving rationally. He's facing a choice. Now, this was the Financial Review, for God's sake, so it wasn't a tabloid newspaper. Well, it is physically, but not sort of literally. Tony Abbott's facing an effective choice. And that is, if you want people to know who you are, and to have a vaguely positive image of you and therefore possibly be prepared to elect you as Prime Minister, you have to put on this silly outfit and ham it up for the cameras and the photographers so that we can get vaguely attractive, very much in inverted commas of course, vaguely attractive content for our media outlet. So there is a kind of deal with the devil that you have to do, which is if you punce around in your Speedos, people will know who you are. And they'll kind of get some vague impression of what you're on about, who you are, what you stand for. If you are all sort of sniffy and snooty and sort of above all that sort of stuff, well, you will maintain your dignity in delightful anonymity. And nobody will have the faintest idea who you are. So there are your choices. So when you start asking yourself, why are these people behaving in this way? And this goes for a lot of the behaviour of the past week or two in the Labor leadership contest that people have been understandably critical of. When you see these things and you're asking yourself, why are these people behaving this way? Ask yourself, what are the sets of incentives and disincentives surrounding them? So what are their core objectives? To win popular support and to achieve high office. So to get promoted, to achieve their ambitions of political leadership. Sometimes it'll be to be Prime Minister, other times it'll be slightly lesser objective. They're their objectives. They're presented with an effective equation that says, if you want to achieve that objective, these are the kinds of things you have to do. And if you don't want to do those things, forget about the objective. I thought it was really interesting that in the wake of her victory, Julia Gillard made a statement about the importance of achieving the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which in some sort of very small pieces of fine print was referred to as a signal that this is being elevated up the agenda, which, if that's correct, is a good thing. And I thought to myself when I saw these, fine print reports, well, isn't that interesting? That a profoundly important issue, where there are really difficult dimensions, including price tag and how it's organised and how it fits with various other arrangements and how we deal with the various state governments and so on, a profoundly important issue which affects a very large number of people in this country, and which every time we did a community cabinet we would have people standing up, carers for kids who are now in their 40s who were worried about who's going to look after them, all these kinds of things. And what is it that the media and public attention focus on? We have absolutely saturation coverage. I was getting, as a has-been sort of person who's long gone, getting 20 plus calls and texts and emails a day from journalists begging me to, say something, do something about the leadership contest. Nobody has contacted me about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, even though this is an issue with which I have quite a lot of familiarity and background.
But Lindsay, in all fairness, after that display last week, can you really expect a journalist to pop back into the serious box? Julia Gillard...
That assumes they were in there at all at some point in the past.
Yeah, that's true. Julia Gillard, came out after the leadership dispute and asked us to forget about what had happened. It's all over now. We're going to honour Kevin Rudd and his wonderful achievements after... I think that you're asking a lot the next day to expect... government to return, and reporting to return to that kind of gravity.
Look, I accept that. I accept that you are dealing with, fractured relationships and fractious relationships that mean that things will be a little bit tense for a while. But a couple of observations. One is that history tells us that these things pass, and they often pass quite quickly, because there is a broader self-interest in play here, that people kind of know that the general public's looking on these events and marking them down. And they also know that if they are seen to allow this stuff to continue too long, then that marking down will become permanent. So generally speaking, these kind of things pass pretty quickly. The second thing I'd say is that the famous Gang of Four, of which I was part, is a really good illustration of how politics actually works most of the time. If you track through in fine detail the careers of Kevin Rudd, Wayne Swan, Julia Gillard and myself, what you will find, as we have seen in some spectacular instances more recently, is that at various occasions those people have been involved in bitter political contests with each other in their CV, going back in some cases the best part of 30 years. At other times they've been allies. So all four of those people are people who have been through a process as they have climbed up the ladder of sometimes fighting viciously with each other, sometimes allied with each other, and whatever. Every conceivable configuration is there if you look for it. But when it really mattered, and when the country literally, like the rest of the world, was kind of staring over the cliff going, oh my God, I wonder what happens if the global financial system disintegrates, what happens after that, those four people functioned with great professionalism, great teamwork, great dedication to do what I still think were the right things to keep Australia in good shape. And so that's really ultimately how politics works. Yes, people do have these kind of often quite nasty battles, but the real test of an individual politician is how they just absorb that and move on and keep their focus on the issues and their responsibilities. And that's a matter of individual judgment for all of us as to what you think about people dealing with those things. But by and large, that is what happens. Time will tell whether that's what happens now, but by and large, that is what happens.
You talk about Tony Abbott in a funny hat or whatever he was wearing on the front page of the paper. I just can't imagine Paul Keating ever doing that.
Neither can I.
You know, he just would have told people to get lost and said what he wanted to say. And I think John Howard would have too. And so that means, you know, this is not just the media. I think there's a kind of taking away of the power of these leaders to actually make choices and to pick the temper and the kind of tone of the way things are going to be. Now, they just don't have to do that stuff. They can say, get lost, I'm not doing it, this is my agenda, this is what matters, this is what we're doing, we're going to take it to the Australian people at the next election. If they don't like it, well, they can tell us.
Look, up to a point, I'd say that's true. I don't think that politicians in this frame are inert objects. So certainly politicians, particularly the leading politicians, do have some capacity to influence the quality of how their craft is portrayed. So I'd agree with that, but my argument would be that that capacity is a lot less than you think. So you're still ultimately caught in this situation where people knowing who you are is the critical characteristic of politics. You know those who would you prefer as leader of the Liberal Party polls or who would you prefer as leader of the Labor Party? Do you know what they are? They are name recognition polls. That's all they are. The starting point is, here's the current leader, do you like them or not? And inevitably half plus of the people say, no, I don't. Okay, who else is there? And you look down the list, oh yeah, that name looks vaguely familiar. They are name recognition polls. Name recognition in a detribalised kind of political process like we now have name recognition is everything. As long as you put my name in the paper, it does not matter what you say. And what I find particularly disturbing is that people are no longer held to account, if they ever were, for things that they said or committed to earlier when perhaps they were in a different position. So,
like a blogger who's now Foreign Minister? Or is that the media taking a spin?
Well, I don't mind if the media takes a swing. In fact, that's a very good thing if people are actually starting to hold people to account and say, well, you now say you believe in X, whereas 5 years ago you said you believe in the opposite of X. We'll explain why. My complaint is that happens very little. And what that means is that people who are in effect climbing the ladder, are presented with a frame that says this to them: you want to get publicity, you want to get on the front page, you want to get on the 6 o'clock news. It does not matter what you say, because in 3 days' time nobody will remember, and nobody is ever going to come back to it and embarrass you with it and make life difficult for you with it in 3 years' time. So therefore, say whatever you like.
What about the climate change tax? I mean, I'm
not talking about political promises. I'm just talking about
people's ideas,
people
and
posturing. People posturing, and why is this happening? Because the media are voracious for content. There will be journalists in the audience tonight who are desperately trying to find something in what I'm saying that is worthy of, that is sufficiently controversial to qualify as, quote, content. And the sad thing is that in some cases, if there isn't anything, they'll effectively kind of grab something I've said, turn it upside down, translate it into Russian, and then translate it into Swahili, and next thing you know, I'll be calling for a revolution or something. Who knows? And that's the nature of the beast. They have got to find content. And it's got to be exciting, it's got to be entertaining, it's got to be shock horror. And, of course, politics mostly, particularly serious issues, is relatively boring. Unless you're a real aficionado, it is relatively boring. So somehow or other you've got to sex and spice this up to be able to sell newspapers and get people to watch TV and listen to the radio. And therefore anybody who comes along who's ambitious and is sort of early on in their career works this out and says, well, basically all I've got to do to advance my cause is not to be really smart, really capable, really dedicated, have good ideas or whatever. What I've got to do is work out how I can play to these needs for content and give them the kind of content that they want, which is some off-the-dial controversial statement, which I'll never be held to account for example, or pouncing about in my Speedos or whatever the case might be. So you've got this kind of self-reinforcing dynamic that goes on here that is ultimately, I think, undermining the quality of democratic discourse in this country.
Perhaps one of those journalists or anybody else would like to have a crack at Lindsay themselves. Put your hand up.
Name yourselves. Who are you?
The ushers will come to you.
Oh, hello. My name's Fran. I'm a citizen. Coming back to the idea of the press, one of the things that I think that we as voters and as citizens required is an informed press. And the whole Gillard-Rudd thing to me was around the fact that so many journalists never conceded that we don't live in a presidential society. We live in a Westminster tradition, and that the person who leads, who is the Prime Minister, is supported by the Labor Party, not only by the people in the House, but by caucus. And that if you are not a team player, if you cannot get people to follow you, you cannot be PM or the leader of the opposition. And the newspapers did not present this, and the news did not present this. And I worry about a lot of young people in their 20s who think, oh, we were cheated. We as voters don't vote for the Prime Minister. We vote for members who then together
All right,
vote.
let's give Lindsay an opportunity to reflect on the Kevin 07 campaign.
Broadly what you say is correct, but it is a bit more complex than that, because the truth is that we have drifted into a far more presidential style of politics, which in a sense has suited everybody. Particularly the media, but it's also suited the political parties and so forth, because it's a lot easier to campaign around the personal attributes of an individual than around a complex policy platform. So we have kind of drifted by default into that zone, and therefore, rightly or wrongly, there are lots of people out there who feel that they have not elected a Labor government that is incidentally led by person X or person Y, but they've elected a government that is led by person X or Y that incidentally happens to be from the Labor Party. And there's an interesting example with the Greater London Council under Ken Livingstone in the 1980s, when, I can't remember the name of the person, but the Labor team was led by somebody else. and won an effective majority on the Greater London Council election. And this person, my apologies for forgetting his name, but this person was then rolled by Ken Livingstone as the leader, and so people woke up the next morning, we just elected the Labor Council, but by the way, it's got a different leader. I can understand why voters, even if they were voting on issues and parties, I can understand why they'd feel a bit kind of miffed about that, because it is a relevant part of the package. So it is a complicated question. I agree with your broad criticism, though, that there is enormous ignorance about, in truth, how the system actually functions.
Look, I'd like to take yet another opportunity to thank the Wheeler Centre for putting on another fantastic discussion group tonight. I've been referring to what's been going on in the Labor Party as political inbreeding for a while. I think there's too many union hacks. There's too many ex-partners of Slater and Gordon. There's too many people who have lived with their political colleagues or had sex with them or whatever it might be. So maybe political...
I deny all the accusations against me.
Maybe political inbreeding could enter the lexicon. Just to change subjects, do you think it would be a good idea if there was a referendum on same-sex marriage? Let's not let the politicians decide, let's let the people decide.
Well, two comments. One, although I'd possibly express it with in slightly more diplomatic terms, I think your opening salvo's broadly accurate. I think that is a problem. And it is a symptom of a party that never really was a mass party but is now shrinking back to its kind of employed core. So I think there is a problem there. I'm not quite sure what to do about it. And there are a range of dimensions to that problem, but it's also connected with the lack of diversity in our parliamentary ranks problem that Sally referred to before. As for your proposition on same-sex marriage, no, I wouldn't agree with that. And this is an observation that you cross out same-sex marriage and insert any issue you like, and I still wouldn't agree with the proposition. And that is that for all of their faults, politicians are accountable elected representatives in a system of representative democracy, and it is not the perfect system of government. There is no perfect system of government, but I think it's better than the alternatives. And if you move to a system where some issues, query which ones and query who decides, where some issues are to be decided by popular vote rather than the legislature as elected, then what you're actually doing is moving to a kind of a different system and incidentally raising a whole host of complex questions about precisely what people are voting on. So, for example, for those of you who are aficionados of British politics like me, you will note that there is this complicated dance going on at the moment with respect to the prospect of independence for Scotland, where the issues in play are the timing of a referendum and how many questions are on the referendum, what options, what the wording of those options is, etc., etc. So the idea of popular votes seems quite attractive, but is fraught with all kinds of difficulties, and it ultimately undermines the system of representative democracy. If you want the classic example where this exists, California, where you've got this absolute shambles because of having superimposed on a classic representative democracy structure with an elected legislature that passes laws. What you've now got is this forest of different propositions, as they're called, superimposed on that are always fought over in the courts and so forth. And you got, of course, what happens is that the various interest groups manage to hog-tie legislators on all kinds of fronts, and the place has effectively become unworkable. Now, popular democracy as a concept, I think, has got some value in a relatively small sort of effectively less developed societies. But when you get to a nation of 23 million people scattered across a very large landmass with considerable diversity, I would suggest it's not a very good idea at all. And so that is neither here nor there with respect to the particular issue you're raising of same-sex marriage. I just don't agree with plebiscites as a way of governing.
Hi, my name's Susan. I'm not a journalist. I'm an activist.
Maybe they haven't turned up. Maybe I'm not as interesting as I thought I was.
And I'm changing the subject again. I'm terribly, terribly concerned about what's happening in Syria, and I think there's a propaganda and humanitarian war against the country. It's very, very complex what's happening, and there could be a failed state. There could be catastrophic war for decades. And it's terribly disturbing that so many well-regarded journalists and commentators have taken on board the single line, and they took it on board from the very beginning, which paints them in a corner. And there are analysts out there that are showing you the complexity and the dangers for the world, but you've got people painted in the corner, and it makes it difficult for politicians, I imagine, who are well advised on what's happening there, to stand up and take a position which is wise for Australia, I think, as well as for the people of Syria, because the media has taken that position. Could you comment on that?
Look, I've been something of an aficionado of Middle East politics for a very long time. Unfortunately, I belong to a generation of people who grew up in the 1970s surrounded by student politics, which was all about the Middle East, which seems a bit bizarre when you consider Australia's sort of on the other side of the world, but that's what it was like. The situation in Syria is extraordinarily complex, and you have got I think a range of players who are acting in ways that reflect a lot of factors that it's difficult for outsiders to fully understand. To some degree, the origins of the issues in Syria go back to the infamous Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916, where France and Britain decided to carve up the Middle East amongst themselves, and France got Syria, and artificial borders were drawn, and so on. Now that's just a contextual factor, but there are all kinds of things layered into it. But to me, just as somebody who's been reading and following this in the media a bit, but not particularly closely, I think that there is kind of one key issue ultimately, and that is that from everything I've seen, the government has well and truly overstepped the line in terms of dealing with dissent within its own country. So it is a fair assessment to say, in some instances where you get an uprising against an authoritarian government, it's reasonable to say, look, don't sort of immediately get carried away and think that 90% of the population support this and it's just, the government without support. It's often more complex than that. And of course you've got the issue here with particular substantial minorities like the Christians and the Kurds and one or two others who have got no love for the regime but fear a Sunni majority regime could be worse for them. So there's all these kind of factors which are not easy for us as outsiders on the other side of the world to understand. But to me, purely from a kind of armchair standpoint now, I'm not an elected representative or anything like that, all the evidence suggests that the government has well and truly stepped way beyond the line in terms of how it's dealing with internal dissent and the extent of bloodshed that is occurring and like shelling civilian areas, which is clearly going on, I think is indefensible.
Lindsay, I find it remarkable that...
And if your assertion is that that's not happening, I'd be interested to hear, because I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming. That's what is happening. Anyway, that's...
we're going to have to, sorry, because we won't pick it up without the mic.
There's what I think credible reports
time.
from credible journalists of newspapers I do regard as serious, who are eyewitnesses to shelling of residential areas in Homs by the military, by the loyalist military.
Lindsay,
in recent times.
I don't know if you feel this when you look at what's happening over there and people, fighting for this democracy, this word that we chuck around here, of course, where democracy here, in our abundance, in our wealth, in our fatness, is kind of pushing up against limits, perhaps. Do you think?
Look, I think it is hard for many Australians to realise just how fortunate we are. It is something that has astonished me through most of my political career. The kind of the culture of discontent and complaint, the outrage industry, otherwise known as the tabloid media. That sense of, I'm hard done by. The bottom line is basically, unless you are a member of particular groups of people in this country who are severely disadvantaged, so sections of the Indigenous population, people with serious disabilities are a couple of examples, but there are some Australians who really, really are in very, very difficult circumstances and doing it tough. But for the vast bulk of us, in human history, in global terms, we are extremely well off. And the Syrian example, just a good illustration. That kind of event is not that unusual, around the world in sort of modern history. We have elections where there's a change of government and there's not the slightest whiff of suggestion that anybody's done anything wrong, where a defeated Prime Minister or Premier stands up and makes a gracious concession speech and thanks their staff and spouse and whatever. There's not many parts of the world where that happens. Politics is about killing people in half the world, and I saw some data the other day. Do you know our income per head, our national income per head is now double that of Spain? Double. We're ahead of the US in national income per head. We are unbelievably fortunate to be Australian.
Really quick, because we've gone a bit over. Really quick.
I'd just quickly like to return to the area that sort of started off in relation to the relationship between the media and the politics. And by the way, thank you both very much for what's been a very interesting evening and one that we appreciate. I think I certainly do, and I'm sure I'm sharing the feelings that we appreciate very much your thoughts and ideas that you've been expressing. But the one area which seems to be a bit of a paradox, which I'd be interested in your reaction to, is this relationship between the media and politicians as to whether or not. It's one thing to sort of say it's the media and or it's the politicians, but is there, and at times the paranoia world will tell you that there is a nexus between them whereby people have got their favoured commentator that they can turn to, or that they've got staffers who've got special arrangements that they know they can feed out and run lines and seriously influence public opinion in that way from their own sectional interests. I'd be interested in your comments. Do you think this is expanding, reducing, a fair commentary, or basically an arena of the paranoia world? No,
it is a fair commentary and it's expanding. So as a senior politician, you become very adept at understanding what the journalists that you are in daily contact with are after. And you kind of know that there are certain things that they would desperately like to get from you that you can't give to them. But there are other things that you can give to them, and you actually try and craft things that suit their interests. So that the extreme example of this is the infamous announceables, where you have this kind of erstwhile government program to spend $50 million on people putting solar panels on their roofs or whatever. And these initiatives are literally very expensive paid party political advertising. So the objective is not to achieve some sort of public policy purpose and improve something. It is to get media coverage and make all of you think that we, the government, or we, the opposition proposing to be the government, are doing something. So the toxic nature of this interaction, I think, is getting quite out of control. So it has got to be, it's getting to be a kind of virtual reality game where more and more, and you know, the Tony Abbott Speedo stuff is just one symptom of this. More and more, all the effort and the energy is going into the manipulation of imagery, which of course is done via the media. So you understand intimately what the journalists and the media outlets need. You know that there are certain bits of that you cannot provide because that will be very damaging for you, possibly internally or externally. But your whole being is directed towards providing that content which serves their needs, a product to sell, and which serves your needs, which is creating positive impressions that fit with the image you wish to convey. And so more and more the energies of politicians are directed into that kind of zone. And the key bit here is that leave aside the ABC and SBS, who are a little bit infected with these things but not much, you are dealing with commercial businesses. These are manufacturers and retailers of information and entertainment. And what they are on about is maximising the number of people who read their newspaper or watch their TV or listen to their radio station. That's what they're on about. And if the product that they generate happens to vaguely bear some resemblance to the truth, that's a happy accident. And that is literally true. That is what they are on about. Overt lies don't sell very well, but there is a vast range of possibility between overt lies and truth. And that's the terrain to be explored, because what you are doing is selling a product. And so when you get all of this hysterical wailing and gnashing of teeth about freedom of the press and the right to know and all this kind of stuff, that is just businesses screaming for less regulation of what they do so they can make more money. That's all it is.
And on that joyful note, we're going to have to wrap it up, but please join me in thanking Lindsay Tanner for being here tonight. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.